I'd like to welcome the family and friends of Gertrude Heather Weedon, better known to you as Heather, to the service here today. We also welcome those who are watching through live stream and have been unable to make it to the chapel. We're here today not to mourn the passing of Heather, but to celebrate her life. Life isn't measured by the years you live, but by the love you gave and the things you did. Yesterday's memories are more precious than gold. They're locked in our hearts to have and to hold. My name is Greg Peters, and it is an honour and a privilege to have been asked by the family to assist with the celebration of Heather's life. Heather was one of 4 children born to parents Izzy and George Staff on the 10th of July 1931 at Castle upon Tyne. Heather was the second eldest child, and there were siblings Dennis, Geoffrey and David, all of whom have passed. Today, we not only think of Heather, but we think of children Jeremy, Linda and Kate who has passed in the loss of their mother. We also think of the 5 grandchildren and the great-grandchildren in the loss of their nana. We also think of the extended families of Dennis, Geoffrey and David in their loss of their sister and auntie. Over the last few years, Heather's health has slowly deteriorated, which saw her pass away on the 9th of May, whilst she was in the care of Orchard's aged care facility. In her special way, Heather has been an important part of your lives and has touched your life in many ways. Each and every one of you have felt the love of Heather as a sister, a wife, a mother, a grandmother, a great-grandmother and an aunt, but most importantly of all, as a true friend. I'd now like to read to you Dover Beach by Matthew Arnold, a reading selected by Jeremy. And it says, "The sea is calm tonight, the tide is full, the moon lies fair upon the straits. On the French coast the light gleams and is gone. The cliffs of England stand, glimmering and vast, out in the tranquil bay. Come to the window, sweet is the night air. Only from the long line of spray, where the sea meets the moon-blanched land. Listen, you hear the grating roar of pebbles, which the waves draw back and fling. At their return up the high strand, begin and cease, and then again begin, with tumultuous cadence slow, and bring the eternal note of sadness in. Sophocles long ago heard it on the Aegean, and it brought into his mind the turbid ebb and flow of human misery. We find also in the sound a thought, hearing it by the distant northern sea. The sea of faith was once, too, at the full, and round earth's shore lay like the folds of a bright girdled furled. But now I only hear its melancholy, long withdrawing roar, retreating to the breath of the night wind, down the vast edges, drear and naked shingles of the world. Ah, love, let us be true to one another, for the world which seems to lie before us like a land of dreams, so various, so beautiful, so new, hath really neither joy, nor love, nor light, nor certitude, nor peace, nor help for pain. And we are here as on a darkling plain, swept with confused alarms of struggle and flight, where ignorant armies clash by night." Family and friends, now comes a time when you have the opportunity to reflect on Heather's life. I'm sure each and every one of you have your own special stories and memories of her. Now's the time to sit back and give thanks for the gift given to you of having shared that life with Heather. Now I'd like to invite son Jeremy to come forward and speak about his mother.
Thank you, Greg. So this is about Gertrude, right? You all knew Gertrude. Yeah, almost nobody in Australia knew that she was named Gertrude. Gertrude was the name of her father's employer in Newcastle, England. And I think Heather's parents made a strategic decision that naming their child after her might be beneficial, I'm guessing, because I don't think they liked the name Gertrude either. They never called her Gertrude. Nobody called her Gertrude. But Gertrude Pickles turned out to be a lifelong, well, not a lifelong, but a childhood benefactor of Heather. So she would buy her clothes. Heather came from a poor background, a poor family. So she would buy her clothes, put on a 21st birthday party, all those kinds of things. Heather was born in 1931 to a poor family, as I said. But in 1931, it's the depths of the Depression, right? So you had this experience in Australia. Almost any working class family had very little to spare in 1931. So it was a tough childhood, I think. She's told me about how she got a penny a week pocket money on a Saturday that she would take straight to the sweet shop and buy everything you could get for a penny. It would have been something in 1935, I suppose. When she was 8 years old, World War II broke out. Now, Newcastle is at the centre of what we call the Tyneside, which back then was a massive, one of the world's big shipbuilding areas. So it was a natural target for German bombs. So Heather's parents decided, as many thousands of other British parents did in 1940, to evacuate her to a Commonwealth country. Izzy had a cousin who lived in Port Kembla. So she was written to, and yes, she will accept Heather and Dennis. The other brothers were too young or not born yet. So off they went to New South Wales at age 9, I think. Or she was 9. Probably some of you have heard the story about that trip to New South Wales. There was actually a book that was in Heather's room when she died called The Singing Ship, which is exactly about that voyage with Heather on it. It was, I believe, a Polish merchant vessel, and it was loaded with about 200 British kids, I think, and dozens of nurses to look after the children. And there were some hundreds of soldiers as well. So it's a funny mixture. So where were the soldiers going? Well, I believe they were going to Singapore. So to be sent to defend Singapore in 1940, well, that would be probably bad news for them. They would have been prisoners of war probably quite soon. It took a long time for them to get there. My memory is the first fleet took about 6 months to get to New South Wales, is that right? They took about 3 months firstly because they did a lot of zigzagging to avoid enemy detection, and secondly because they had quite long periods at ports of call. So she would describe having visited exotic towns like Cape Town, Bombay, and about how the townspeople would come to greet the ship. And she remembers people giving them oranges, giving the kids oranges. But there weren't any oranges in Britain in 1940, so this was exotic. They'd give them little gifts. They'd invite them home for tea. So there was a lot of hospitality from the Commonwealth ports that they dropped in at. She's also talked about their soldiers. The kids loved the soldiers. The soldiers treated them very well. They told them stories. They made them little wooden artifacts, dolls and that kind of thing. They put on plays for the kids. So she has very fond memories of interacting with the soldiers. And later in life, this was a story that she told over and over again. It became clear to me 10, 20 years ago that this was possibly the central event of her life in many ways, the things that she had most memories about. So that was the singing ship. When they got to Port Kembla, things weren't quite so good. The aunt and uncle who were supposed to look after them didn't treat them well, and in fact they were physically abused. So she had 5 fairly miserable years, I think, in New South Wales, which made her later in life reluctant to come back, I'm afraid. When she got to high school, she had to commute into Wollongong. I suppose there wasn't a high school in Port Kembla back then, so she talks about that. Anyway, in 1945, back they came to England. By that time, her parents had migrated across the country. My grandfather, who was physically disabled, had only ever had very poor paying jobs. So here was a war job that was offered him if he moved across to the west coast of England, maintaining Spitfires on an aerodrome. So she finished high school there, and then she went to Teachers College in Liverpool. She spent 3 years learning to be a primary school teacher. I think the main skill that she learned at college was how to teach 5-year-olds to read. If you ask me what Heather's contribution to society was, other than having children, I would have to say teaching innumerable children in Britain and in Australia how to read, including me and including my sisters. And I got off to a strong academic start because I could already read by the time I started school. So I owe most of that to Heather. Around 1954, she decided that she was going to seek her fortune in the Commonwealth. So she signed up with what was once called the Colonial Office to be a teacher in Uganda. There weren't any settlers in Uganda, but it was administered by the British government. So she was going to go to Africa to teach children how to read, but not African children, because she didn't have the language skills, and the school system, I'm sure, would have been completely segregated in the 1950s. So she spent 2 or 3 years there. Shortly after she arrived, she met my father, Tony. They were married the following year. And then the year after that, I came along, a year or so after that, I came along. So they decided to take me back to England to show me off to the Rells, as you do. So once we got back to England in 1957, the Rells persuaded them not to go back to Africa. So that was the end of her brief African career. So now so they settled not in northern England, which is her origins, but in southeast England, because Dad was a Londoner. So we lived for many years in southeast England. In 1972, Tony had a frankly rather harebrained scheme to make a lot of money in New South Wales in business. So back goes Heather to New South Wales, this time not with her brother, but with a hubby and 3 kids. We settled at a little rented place in Point Clare, and I enrolled with Kathy at Henry Kendall High School, which is where I finished. After several addresses around Gosford, they eventually built a house behind Point Clare Cemetery, which became her home for the rest of her life. It's right on the edge of the bush. Some of you, probably most of you, have visited that house. It's right on the edge of the bush, and so critters would come out of the forest every now and then. We would see certainly possums, lyrebirds, brush turkeys, an occasional wallaby. So that was an interesting place to live, right on the edge of the wilderness, it seemed to me. There was constant threat of fires. Bushfires was a big issue living there. They had to be evacuated a couple of times. When she was in her early 50s, I suppose the conditions that, I haven't got to this yet. So teaching in Australia, the teaching service didn't have a job for her teaching 5-year-olds. But they did have a job teaching 10-year-olds at a Wyoming school. So I think she was a little intimidated by the idea of teaching 10-year-olds. She wasn't familiar, obviously she had 10-year-olds, but it's a quite different skill teaching 10-year-olds. But eventually she got used to it, and I think she decided eventually that she preferred working with 10-year-olds. Obviously the communications are easier, and you don't have to work so hard on tying shoelaces and dealing with toileting issues the way you do with the babies. In her early 50s, she got the chance to retire. So given that she lived till 91, meant that nearly half her life she was in retirement. So now she has to figure out what she's going to do as a retired woman. So she developed a number of hobbies. One was social golf. She played golf once or twice a week. A second big preoccupation was guiding. So my first friend in Australia was Kathy here. Thank you for coming. Kathy's mother, Marigold, and Heather became close friends. And Marigold, I think, was the one who introduced her to guiding. So that became a strong part of her social life after she retired, particularly. She became Gosford District Commissioner, I think. I don't know how high in the hierarchy that would be of guiding. But there was a strong adult social element to guiding as well. So she belonged to an organization called the Trefoil Guild. Marigold was in the Trefoil Guild, I imagine. So this became the center of her social life in the 80s and 90s, I would say. So she spent a lot of time. They had all kinds of social events for themselves. They went on bus tours, and they had parties and stuff that didn't involve the kids. So she got to know a lot of guiders. I'd like to think that some of those ladies are still with us, but they would probably be 91 as well if they are still around. So guiding was a big thing. She did a lot of reading. Heather and Tony were both avid novel readers. So whether we lived in England or whether we lived in Australia, every second week it was off to the public library. They would get 8 books between them. And a fortnight later, both of them had read most of those books. They watched television while they read novels. I mean, I don't know how they manage. How a working mum manages to get through 6 novels in a fortnight, I don't know. I don't know. They're always the same kinds of novels. Dad's novels were always about spies and war, like boy novels, and her novels were girl novels. They were historic romances, that kind of thing. I don't know how many biographies she read of Mary, Queen of Scots, possibly a dozen or more. She was a great number of historical romances that have, I think, been written about her. So I remember that. She was also very keen on Wilbur Smith. I don't know how many of you have ever read Wilbur Smith. You've read Wilbur Smith. She had a whole collection of Wilbur Smith, and not even from the library. She had these in the bookcase at home, so I guess she was so... I haven't read any of his stuff, but she was so interested in Wilbur Smith that she wanted to buy these books and collect them. So that was the reading thing. Then there was gardening. So Heather and Tony were both keen gardeners. In England, we had a rose garden, of which they were quite proud. So anyone with any self-respect in England has a rose garden, right? It's the thing that English people do in the garden. When we got to Australia, rose gardening was more of a challenge. It's too hot here for roses. So they moved into native plants like these ones, and also orchids. She became very fond of orchids. One of the things that I have in common with her is a love of orchids. So that's where these orchids come from. She had about 20 pots of orchids that were arranged along the wallways in the front drive of the house at Point Clare. So orchids were a major part of her life. So there's a lot of hobbies here, arts and crafts, right? That was huge. So she was always good at this stuff. Heather and I were always emotionally close, even though for half my life I've lived 10,000 miles away. We are chalk and cheese in most ways. Things that I'm quite good at, she's terrible at, and the other way around as well. So I would love to be able to draw and paint. That would be a wonderful skill as far as I'm concerned, but I couldn't do any of that at all. But she was very good at this stuff. She did embroidery, as well as drawing and painting. And she came to visit me in North America in the 1980s. And she was introduced to American quilts. She was so taken by American quilts that the first thing she did when she got back to New South Wales was to found a quilting club. I don't know how many quilts Heather produced. I have seen dozens of photos, many dozens of quilts. I've had several on my beds over the years, so that's always an attachment that I've had with her. When she got old enough that quilts became too complicated, she switched to knitting. So what did she knit? Well, when I was a kid, she would knit us elaborate cable-stitched sweaters with shawl necks, all kinds of amazing stuff that she could produce. But in later life, what she knitted was squares. Now, Australians apparently know about knitting squares. I have not encountered anybody outside of Australia who knits squares. But what you do is you produce dozens of these squares, about this kind of size, as I recall, and somebody arranges them on the floor, and what's going to be the best aesthetic combination of the squares, and they get stitched together, and they were sent to poor people in South America, is what she told me. I don't know what else she would do with them. So they've got all these lovely hand-knitted blankets. So blankets was a big thing. She never had much of an interest in music. She was much more interested in fine arts, I would say, and crafts than in performing arts. So when I was asked to come up with some pieces of music, I couldn't think of very much. I mean, I rarely heard her singing or playing the radio or whistling tunes. That wasn't really her thing very much. But I think, again, under the sponsorship of Gertrude Pickles, as a young woman, she did learn to play the piano. And when we lived in England, we had a little piano. And I can remember she could do some very interesting things on the piano, including playing versions of classical pieces, as well as pop songs that she knew from the 1940s, all kinds of stuff on the piano. I don't think the piano got to Australia. Maybe she had a keyboard or something at some stage. I don't quite remember. You think she did? Yeah, I think that's right. I don't remember hearing her play it, though. Did you hear her play it? Yeah, okay. So that did persist to some extent. So eventually it got to the stage where she wasn't really able to carry on these things herself very much. But for a long time when she was in the nursing home, the first 5 or 6 years that she was at the orchards, I would visit once a year for a week or two. That was about all I could really manage coming from that distance. But I have a lot of fond memories of sitting in the recreation room at the orchards playing canasta or Scrabble. I can remember the arguments about whether you were permitted to put vulgar words on the board, that kind of thing. When canasta and Scrabble became a bit too difficult, well, then it was on to bingo. So she played bingo for little packets of lollies. So that's what we did for several years. There came a time when I wasn't able to come to Australia because of the pandemic, so I missed her for about 3 years. We did talk on the phone, we had regular phone calls. But when I came back last year after the pandemic, that was the point at which she no longer knew who I was. But by that time, she didn't really know who anybody else was either. So one of the things I would do would be to pull out a family snapshot from the 1990s and say, do you know who this is? Do you know who that is? And towards the end, she didn't know any of these people. So when it came clear that she didn't know who I was, well, we couldn't really have a phone call. She wasn't really able to sustain a conversation, had no idea who I was. So the phone call stopped, I'm afraid, last year. So that was the last contact that I had with her. What kind of person was Heather Weedon? Well, as a kid, I would have to say, as a son, I would have to say she was a fantastic mother. She was a really wonderful mother. She was conscientious. She was patient. She was even-tempered. I don't remember her ever yelling at any of us. We very rarely got slapped. So, yeah, she really knew how to do the job as a mother. So that's something, obviously, that I'm enormously grateful to her for. As far as her relationships with adults, I would describe her as very sociable without being particularly gregarious. She was always polite. I never knew her to be rude to anybody or to yell at anybody. I don't remember any event up until right near the end of that kind. So she was a wonderful person to me, and I'm sure many others. I found myself thinking this week about what I didn't like about Heather. So that's not something you're probably going to talk about at a funeral. And if I had a long list of grievances or grudges, I wouldn't be talking about them. The only thing that I can think of, and this may amuse you or not, I don't know. The only thing I could think about was Sunday school. Now, Heather grew up in a somewhat strict Methodist family in northern England, but I think that by the time she got married, she'd probably left religion behind her. Dad never talked about religion at all, but if you pressed him on it, he would admit to being an atheist. So these are not religious people in any way, really, in my lifetime. We went to Sunday school, though, when we were children. I think both of my sisters went. And it was fine when I was a small child. I didn't mind going to Sunday school. You know, we got told stories, we collected little stamps, all kinds of stuff like that. The singing, that was fun. Oh, singing, I didn't mention singing. Along with the piano, she loved to sing. So they would, at the orchards, they would have a weekly sing-along. And you get to sing The Road to Gundagai and other old Aussie pop songs. And then later in life, and then she went to the religious services as well. Not because she found the minister to be boring, but she loved singing the hymns. So singing became one of her principal interests late in life. Oh, I've forgotten what I was saying about the singing now.
Sunday school.
Hmm? Sunday school, yes. So we sang at Sunday school. It's Methodist Sunday school. Every Methodists sing all the time. The Wesley brothers wrote all these hymns. So as a small child, that was fine. By the time I got to be about 9, I was starting to think it was boring and stupid, honestly. But we had to go. And I can remember on at least a couple of occasions having a crying fit about not having to go to Sunday school. But we went to Sunday school till I was about 13, by which time it was a complete joke to me. So why are they insisting on the Sunday school? You have to ask if they have no religious convictions. And I'm almost sure now, in retrospect, I haven't discussed this with her, but it was all about getting the kids out of the house for a couple of hours. I'm almost sure that's what it was about. And it probably had to do with physical contact between them, let's say. So that's what I've deduced about that. So that's no grudge that I hold against my parents at all after 50 years, but that's the one thing that I can think about that I didn't like about Heather as a parent or as a human being. I think that's about all I have to say, Greg.
Thank you.
All right? Oh, cheers.
I think you'll agree, such many reflections and memories of Heather's life. Friends, the family, thank you for your attendance today in remembering Heather's life. And Jeremy is going to go to the Arimba RSL Club after the service, and you're more than welcome to join him there. Heather, as you watch over those you have loved, I know that this is not a goodbye, but a thank you. Thank you for touching their lives and giving them joy. Thank you for the memories they will cherish forever. Thank you for the good times and your hard work. Thank you for your love and for your laughter. But most of all, thank you, Heather Weedon, for being you. You leave this world a richer place than you found it. Family and friends, can I ask you to please stand?
I was going to ask people to speak if they would like to speak.
Oh.
Do we have time for that? We did talk about that.
Yeah, we did, but we're running out of time.
Because I talked too long. Right.
It was
Talk
excellent.
later.
Maybe if they go to the RSL Club with you and speak there. Family and friends, as we entrust Heather's body to the elements, earth to earth, dust to dust, ashes to ashes, may her spirit fly free and peace be her fit to us all. We tenderly, lovingly and reverently commit Gertrude Heather Weedon to nature's keeping and remember her life with gratitude. May any regrets you feel today be turned into gratitude for your time with Heather. May the chill of your parting give way to the warmth and sunshine of her memory that you will cherish forever. Leave here today knowing Heather is at peace. Amen.